On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, U.S. President Donald Trump, in a CNBC interview, says he's ready to levy duties on Chinese imports worth $500 billion. World markets drop on the news. Many wonder how badly will it affect the world economy. One Korean team in the Daejeon table tennis games. Ping-pong diplomacy to keep the momentum in the Korean Peninsula.
India is a pharmaceutical because we have a merciful government.
And the Chinese film Dying to Survive, an eye-opener to expensive cancer treatment in China, sparking efforts to find solutions. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin our show today with the rising rhetoric in the trade war between China and the United States. Earlier today, U.S. President Donald Trump made another shock announcement on the media, saying he's ready to slap tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese imports in an interview with CNBC News. Current tariffs only targeting about $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. The new tariffs, according to the report, are designed to push China to give concessions in its alleged unfair trade practices and intellectual property infringement, according to the media report. On Wednesday, China's Ministry of Commerce expressed its resolve in standing up against all foreign pressures and the upholding of the international rules-based trading system. For more on the latest development, I'm joined here in Beijing by Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Sir, welcome to our program. Very briefly from you, your reaction upon hearing the news coming from the CNBC reports.
Oh, when I hear this news, I feel so amazing. I'm afraid this is most crazy.
I guess you're saying shocked, right?
Of course. That would be the most crazy trade policy, in economic history. Also, that actually Trump has different type of targets, on China. Not only trade deficit issues, but also, how to constrain China's development and China's strategic industrial development in the future, as well as his domestic, political, vision. That is his,
right.
He wants to win the midterm election.
Right now, we see the world markets drop immediately as a result of this wild statement in a media report coming from the United States. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm afraid that in economics, not only we'll be amazing by media, but also economic circle as well as consumers and residents, because you can imagine that this type of policy will seriously impact on confidence of the market. Meanwhile, I like to give you an example that is due to right now, in short term, due to tariff on steel, and the nail manufacturers in the U.S. collapsed, bankrupted, and then created jobs in the U.S. Another case is that, for example, U.S. car automakers maybe increase their investment in China or in other places in order to avoid, China's tariff on those U.S. products. So all of those, bad results will cause, job decreasing in the U.S.
The United States originally decided to impose $34 billion worth of Chinese goods with punitive tariffs. China reacted to that. Obviously, the United States, many believe, has the responsibility of stopping this trade war. Mr. Zhang, do you think that is happening? What does it take for the U.S. to realize the negative effect that this trade war is having on its own economy, on China's economy, and certainly on the world economy as a whole? You heard the business community coming from all over the world saying they are on the path to lose money as a result of this.
Actually, today, China, the U.S., two countries, and all over trade partners in the world has a very clear, attitude. That is, global supply chain already make us becomes, we have to work together, and also we will impact each other. So in this regard, we hope that the U.S. side could take a more responsible trade policies and economic policies. Also, the U.S. as the biggest economy has to consider, their own, domestic economic and job issues, and how to make, globalization on the right track.
All right, if they really cares.
Yeah.
Of course. For now, we want to thank you, Zhang Jianping, who is coming from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Really appreciate it, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. You are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Stay with us. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. In the past few months, there have been breakthroughs in the relations between the DPRK and South Korea. Earlier this week, the International Table Tennis Federation began 6 days of competition in Daejeon. The DPRK sent 16 competitors and 9 officials for the very first time ever. It is also the very first time in 27 years the two countries, DPRK and South Korea, formed a joint table tennis team, marking the 4th joint inter-Korean sports team in history. And these two sides will also form a joint team to compete together in 3 sports in the Asian Games in Indonesia next month. The collaboration began in Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in February, and the two leaders summit in April. For more discussion on the Korean Peninsula situation, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, associate in the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Thank you, sir, for coming over to our Beijing studio. Also joining us in Seoul, South Korea, we have Dr. Cho Ham Choi, who is president of the Institute for Peace and Unification of Korea. Dr. Choi, welcome. And in Los Angeles, last but not least, Jonathan Pollack, a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and the John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Welcome as well. I want to start with both our South Korean and the Chinese panelists, talking about the relations between North and the South. Dr. Choi, very briefly, tell me about what is happening. On the one hand, joint team table tennis seems like table tennis diplomacy. On the other hand, though, the North Korea and South Korea's interaction about family reunion might be cancelled. What exactly is going on?
Well, actually, if you get some smooth relationship between two anniversary, states, then it is very difficult. It is very important to depoliticize their relationship. The sports is a good example for two nations to get some friendly relationship, to get the contact and the cooperations. That's the very significant issues, actually,
Yeah, what about that? The scrap off possibly of the family reunion event likely to take place in August?
Well, actually, the family reunion, North Korea's demand some North Korean refugees should return before the separation, separating people's family reunion. So still, South Korea, has not responded to North Korea's demands. That's why they are North Koreans sometimes threatening to cancel.
Right.
But I think finally the separation of the family reunion can be fulfilled.
Okay. We got several numbers to share with our audience. On my hand, we have, according to sources, 31,000 DPRK residents flew to South Korea over the past few decades. Meanwhile, you've also got 20,000 North and South families members got reunited for a few days under those so-called family reunion schemes. So, Mr. Zhao here in Beijing, how shall we see this mixed picture?
Well, I think this is typical North Korean negotiating strategy. If we recall last time when North Korea invited international journalists to monitor the close down of the nuclear test site, it also kept the South Korean journalists waiting for days in Beijing for their North Korean visa and only granted the visa in last minute. I think the North Korean strategy to create a maximum pressure in order to elicit maximum concession cooperation from South Korea. I think this wouldn't seriously impact the family reunion in August.
This is only a technical way of dealing with what they consider as the biggest opportunity. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Zhao?
I think that's the case, and by the way, the issue between the two Koreas right now, over the 12 North Korean female workers, was created by the previous South Korean government. I don't think North Korea would hold that against this current progressive government.
I see. There are leeways, it seems. But having said that, though, Mr. Choi, what about the economy in DPRK coming from South Korea's perspective? We have been reading some of the latest numbers. The earlier year, 2017, likely to be a shrink of 3.9%, but that is according to South Korean sources. The DPRK has their own sources and their own number. But Dr. Choi, help us to understand what does sanction mean for the DPRK economy as the South Koreans see it, and what does that mean for the possible chances of interaction between the two Koreas?
Well, first of all, the possible interaction, especially in economy area, I think there is a great possibilities to get economy exchange in the corporations. Also, South Korea regards and estimates North Korea's economic development is going on. So it is a high time for South Korea to invest or to get some cooperation from North Korea. So for South Korean government or South Korean people, they have some kind of good opportunity to get investment into the North Korea.
Do you see that is really happening, Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, particularly after, let's just say, the Singapore summit, after the interactions of the DPRK leader to many of the countries that he needs to deal with directly?
I think there are contradictory signs. Even though there were recent reports of North Korean economy contracting last year, there are also other indicators. For example, the North Korean currency has been stable over the last year. That's a sign of a stable baseline economy. So I think, given that North Korea has been criticizing South Korea, dragging its feet in the negotiations with the United States, I think North Korea is still feeling that it is okay in terms of its economic performance. There is no prospect of any imminent economic crisis in North Korea, and therefore North Korea is still, I think, negotiating from a position of strength.
I see. Mr. Choi, before we go to another guest, let me ask you once again, what does that mean from your perspective? This inter-Korea interaction, meaning for the overall denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. What does that mean, really? What role is it playing?
Well, for South Korean people, the most important thing to get solution to solve the North Korean nuclear issue, actually we have to get some kind of North Korean bureaucracy or North Korean leaders' some agreement. They are ready to give up the nuclear ambition. So that's why it is very important for South Korea to interact first, and then to solve the nuclear issue. So that's the very typical approach for South Korean because we have one people actually in nature.
That's true.
Right.
That's true.
That's why we South Koreans emphasized, another to some extent a different approach from other countries.
Interact first and then try to solve the problem, coming up with a blueprint. That's what the South Korean guest is saying. Mr. Polak, coming from the U.S., you've been attentive listening to your two colleagues earlier. Tell me about that, particularly from an American perspective. What does it mean, the two Korea interactions, for a U.S. blueprint about how to resolve that?
what strikes me very, very much is how much the interactions between North and South have become detached from any realistic or feasible approach with respect to genuine denuclearization. The two realms have separated, and this is in part, I think, because of President Trump's visit to Singapore and his statements since then. In effect, he's giving a green light to all kinds of explorations that others might undertake with North Korea. So North Korea is in a position that, frankly, is very, very favorable for its interests. I would agree with Jiao Tong. You can see a number of indications of this. But the real question is whether or not any conditions will be imposed and expected on the part of North Korea if we are to see, in some sense, a true synchronization of these two very separate levels. Right now we don't see it. We see the pressure off.
Okay.
We see the maximum pressure policy, frankly, more as a slogan at this point than a reality. And I think that that's what a lot of other countries, China, South Korea, Russia, are calculating. They see the possibilities for beginning to develop various kinds of relationships with the North independent of the United States.
I see. Mr. Zhao, it seems that Mr. Pollack is trying to accuse China, South Korea, and Russia rather of not necessarily getting things moving as a result of taking advantage of what the Americas has been doing in the Singapore summit. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think it's true that given the trade war between U.S. and China, the very unreasonable demand from President Trump in the trade war, China has less incentive to cooperate with the United States. But I don't think China has any motivation to violate existing UN sanctions. China can start enhancing economic cooperation with North Korea in areas that comply with existing UN sanctions. With that said, I agree with Mr. Pollack that there is no real progress on denuclearization. In fact, there is even increasing gap between President Trump and his own senior advisors. Pompeo, when he came back from his third visit in Pyongyang, he said that progress was made, but in fact, it was reported that in private discussions, he admitted that he doesn't believe North Korea is going to denuclearize. So
that is an interesting question. I should throw it right back to Mr. Pollack right here. Inside the United States, you don't have a streamlined consensus of how to deal with the DPRK. You have different messages sending out of Washington alone, actually out of this administration alone, and therefore, how could the others get the right message and work with the United States about that? And having said that, though, there are a lot of issues that the U.S. has picked up with many of its neighbors in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, with South Korea, with China, with Japan about trade and many other issues. How there could be any trust in moving anything forward, Mr. Pollack?
It's going to be exceedingly difficult, even as you've reported tonight on your program. President Trump's latest threats to basically impose tariffs and economic sanctions at every conceivable level with China. It may just simply be something to keep his political base riled up, but China has few incentives at this point to, in any measurable ways, respond.
My question, Mr. Pollack, can you not turn the table? The question really is talking about your politics back in Washington. It's about your divisions in Washington, your divided views about how to deal with everything. Of course, you are not representing the administration here, Mr. Pollack.
You said it's not my policy. It's not only President Trump's policy, but it's a sense of incredibly mixed messages, contradictory statements. This has bedeviled American policy almost throughout the heightening of tensions about the North Korean nuclear program. But it begins with President Trump himself. He has, in essence, claimed that the United States is making good progress with North Korea. There's no discernible evidence with respect to these core U.S. goals that, in fact, that is happening. And so it's now landed in Secretary of State Pompeo's lap, and it sounds to me as if on his most recent visit to North Korea, for the first time, Secretary Pompeo tabled the core American concerns, and North Korea has rejected all of them. So we're in this situation where, frankly, if North Korea's goal is to buy as much time as possible, the United States is really doing a very good job of making that possible.
Well, Mr. Polak, may I remind you once again, it is the United States America president. Mr. Trump is not an individual. He is representing the United States when he's speaking to the rest of the world. So we cannot just say that's his words, but rather the U.S. is having this word represented by your president. Obviously, your other branches of government have not spoken up about this. What the policies, Mr. Zhao, of the DPRK issue and the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue become a domestic political issue inside the United States, how much hope is there for China to work with it?
Well, there is, I think, no very great hope there because, on the one hand, even if U.S. Wants to resort back to the maximum pressure campaign to impose additional sanctions on North Korea, we have to remember that every sanction measure has its own half-life. It's like radioactive material. Over time, the effectiveness of that sanction measure will decay. So North Korea over time will come up with more evasive measures to avoid the impact of sanctions. So there is very little way the U.S. can use coercive pressure to force North Korea to make more concessions. By the way, given that the diplomatic failure of the Helsinki summit, I think Trump has more internal incentive to make image that he is making progress on the North Korean front. So we are likely to see, I think, more concessions on the American side.
Well, he said it's working. He said the DPRK is denuclearizing. That's what he said. Well, if you take his words. Dr. Choi, before we go, we also certainly want to have very important views coming from the South Korean side when the U.S. politics is so much about domestic politics, even on international issues such as the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. What does that mean for South Korea? How much choice do you have?
Well, actually, we don't have a particular choice. Only we have a choice to get along with North Korea, people-to-people contact, and to get the North Korean people's, ordinary people's, some minds. Both Koreans want to have a peaceful solution. That's the one thing.
All right.
That is the most important thing.
Well, in fact, we appreciate all the hard work coming from all sides that are working on this issue. But for now, I want to thank all of you for being with us. Chu Hum Choi, Jonathan Polak, and Zhao Tong. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Have a great weekend. You are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Dying to survive, an eye-opener to the high cost of cancer treatment in China. We'll talk about finding solutions right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Premier Li Keqiang says recently reforms on imported cancer treatment drugs aren't happening quick enough, and he seeks to impose price cuts as soon as possible. The statement comes as the recently released dark comedy Dying to Survive leads to heated debates across the country on the dilemma of cancer patients with expensive treatment. It tells the story of a man smuggling cheap drugs from India, actually, for leukemia for his patients here in China because they cannot afford patented drugs. The movie has tapped into public resentment over the high costs of medicine as well as the struggles of Chinese families with affordable health care. Why is the film Dying to Survive such a hot button in China? Why people are flocking to the movie theaters to watch that low-budget movie? I'm joined here, first of all, by Teng Jinmeng, who is a freelance movie critic and also cultural commentator. Professor Teng, welcome to our program. What do you make of it, this popular movie, overnight almost in China?
I think first thing first is the realistic take on that very pressing Chinese issues, the issue of public health care and also justice. These are all the issues that I think that captured the attention of the viewing public here in China.
Well, $330 million already in the box office. That's only the very beginning, 1 week when the movie is in the theater. Really impressive. Plus, this is such a low-budget movie. What it's about is really just a story. That story is essential.
Yeah, the story, I mean, storytelling, I mean, like this one, this is a rousing piece of grab the headline sort of a storytelling, which means that the social realism, which has been always the hot button in our society.
But lacked in the movie industry over the past few years.
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the Chinese big screen has been permeated by the Hollywood-style fantasy, costume dramas, and I think that's going to be stopped.
Having said that, though, what about that movie? I mean, in a way, it is about one man's journey. However, it's told in such a dark, humorous way. And yet, it's not necessarily a 100% perfect movie. People do not care even about some of the plots could go a little bit off the road, but rather people are just grabbed by the content of it. I know in China, Professor Tang, as a seasoned cultural critic, you know it, that when something is about the reality of the Chinese society coming out, it is going to grab the attention, particularly about healthcare.
Well, absolutely. I mean, healthcare is one issue, and there are many other issues, for example. And as the one of the film characters pointed out, that poverty remained a challenging issue here in China. And so the film touched upon that issue and touched upon some of the most pressing issues in this very particular case. But once again, I think ultimately it's a film about social criticism, because China still, and take healthcare for example, still have lots of shortcomings, and in this case the film helped us to put that on spotlight, as Premier Lee has spotlighted.
Right, if we have some of those, there we go, some of the scenes coming from the movies reflected here, but not just this movie alone. We have quite a number of movies talking about the health situation of the general public, about hospital, about healthcare reform in China back in the 1980s until now. It has since been resolved as reflected by the movies.
Well, back in the 1980s, as we talk about in private, for example, 人到中年, up to the Middle Ages, there were issues such as aging, political persecutions, and conveyances, political stuff, and like that. And so
doctors underpaid, of course.
Patients are paid, by the patients, but issues like others, for example, for example, Chen Kai-ge's cat caught on the web. All these are also about issues that we are now witnessing in the age of the internet. So we have lots of issues, and so issue-driven films are going to come back in vogue. And so Hollywood big blockbuster films such as, I mean, the Terminators, Jurassic Parker, and all that stuff. I think Chinese audience need a break from that.
All right. Thank you so much, Teng Jimeng, for being with us.
Thank
really
you for
appreciate it. The hit movie Dying to Survive is not only breaking box office records, but it has also sparked discussion among audiences about the life and death struggle of cancer patients with expensive treatment. The financial burden on cancer patients and their families is a real-life experience. China's efforts to cut the cost of cancer treatment drugs is on track, but there is still a lot to be done. We're going to talk about that right after this backgrounder.
Despite breakthroughs in treatment, cancer remains a top killer. According to the Red Cross Society, nearly 3 million people die of cancer each year. And the population is growing larger, with new diagnoses increasing by 4.3 million each year. Cancer is not only a physical and psychological burden to patients, but also a tremendous financial strain on them and their families. Targeted therapy is one of the most effective treatments, but many medicines are imported and are not covered by the country's public health insurance. This means that cancer medicine can cost the patient hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket every year.
The drug price is affordable for some middle and high-income city dwellers, but not for most low-income families.
Some families barely scrape by in order to keep their loved ones alive, even going as far as smuggling cheap generic drugs from India. China is working to fix the problem. Through state procurement and negotiations, dozens of cancer medicines have been put on the list of drugs that are covered by public health insurance netting patient savings of up to 88%. This May, China exempted all imported cancer drugs from tariffs. There should be more affordable drugs available to the public soon.
World Insight, and now we continue our panel with Fang Hai in our Beijing studio. He's a professor at the China Center for Health Development Studies at Peking University. And in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we have Kate Tulenko, who's the CEO of Corvus Health. And welcome to both of you. May I start with you, Professor Fang? Why, still, China already cut tariff to 0 when it comes to cancer drugs? Why is it still so expensive domestically?
Because there are a lot of meet persons or meet channels between the sellers or the suppliers and the patients. So the transaction cost is very high, and maybe double or triple of the original selling price.
When is that likely to be resolved, do you think? What does it take to resolve it?
Actually, the Chinese government is doing something. For example, the National Health Insurance Administration try to negotiate the prices with the specific healthcare and the pharmaceutical companies to purchase the drug directly from the company and then sell it to the hospitals. So if the hospital didn't charge anything extra, so that would be very, very good price for the patients.
Of course, Ms. Tulenko is also with us. This is not a Chinese phenomenon alone. Cancer drugs and some of the important drugs not covered or covered only partly by the health care bill is very much likely to be smuggled, even between the United States and Canada, if you look at the recent news from the United States. So what does it mean, this cross-border and obviously global trade of cancer drugs and important drugs? Ms. Tulenko.
Yes, well, it's important to explain that many of these new cancer drugs are biologicals. That means they're very complex biological molecules such as antibodies or hormones, and they need to be made by bacteria or by cells in culture, so it's very expensive to make them. So that's one of the reasons why there's a greater expense than some of the chemical drugs, some of the older chemotherapy drugs. And then the second issue is that of brand. So most countries recognize patents, where companies who invented a drug have about 10 years to sell it exclusively, and then generic drugs can be made. And so for that reason, because many of these are brand drugs, because they're still new, they're very expensive.
What about what's going on online, for example? People purchase those drugs coming from Canada because it's much cheaper than in the United States. And Ms. Tulenko, has that ring also a bell from your policymakers?
Exactly. So the cross-border trade issue in the drugs. So there are two cases here. One is China and India. So in India, in 1970, the Indian Patent Act did away with patents for pharmaceuticals. So Indian drug makers could make any drug they wanted without a patent, and that's what really drove the growth of the Indian generic market, and that's why they're able to make these drugs quite affordably in India, and then they're traded or sometimes smuggled to China. So that's one set that's going on. The other set that you mentioned is between Canada and the U.S. So in Canada, the Canadian government negotiates with drug manufacturers to lower the prices of drugs, and that's why the prices are more affordable, whereas in the U.S. Government chooses not to negotiate and instead has an open market system. But as a result, because of that, the drugs are more expensive.
Right. Mr. Fang, this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Ironic, though, an open market system likely to produce, believed by some, the best result, but not necessarily, as Ms. Tulenko also illustrated, when it's really coming into practice. But on the other hand, you cannot, just as China has not been, just copying others' IPR and patent drugs and make it your own. And therefore, there is a huge price difference between, let's just say, China's and some of the other countries. So what to deal with this? I mean, on the one hand, respect our patents and also respect the market rule. But on the other hand, it is the lives that we are talking about. It is the equal opportunities of surviving for all in different countries, whether developing or developed economies, that we are talking here.
Actually, China is trying to reduce the price of drugs and other pharmaceutical products. I think the best way actually is reform and opening up policy. Reform means that the Chinese pharmaceutical companies or domestic pharmaceutical companies can do the R&D and develop a very good drug for the patients, and then in China, so I think that cost will be very, very low. On the
Why
other,
they are not doing it so far?
because the size of pharmaceutical company, a domestic pharmaceutical company in China is low, is small. So, but the cost for the R&D for new chemical entity or we say active ingredients is very, very expensive. So we do not have so much money to do the research and development. So I think the government should do something, like say organize a very big national company, or maybe provide a very good like a tax subsidy or others to persuade them to do something.
Will that change the picture, Ms. Tulenko, coming from the U.S. experiences, really? Or maybe you can use the example of Canada, as it sounds probably more successful than that of the U.S.
So you have this tension between access and innovation.
Yes.
So in order to make drugs accessible, you lower the price. But if pharmaceutical companies don't make much money, they therefore don't have the money to invest in creating new drugs. It can take hundreds of millions or $1 billion to create a new drug. And so that's what we need to think about. And in China right now, the big issue is access. And so that's why you see the push towards generics. There's not that much investment in creating new drugs. If we look at Europe, you see a very different picture. Most Europeans have access to the current drugs, to the drugs they need. But if you look into the future, and the fact that it's estimated by 2030, Europe will be spending about $250 billion a year on Alzheimer's and dementia care, Europe desperately needs to invest in creating new drugs to treat dementia and Alzheimer's, because they will not be able to pay for all the care of people with dementia and Alzheimer's. So Europe needs innovation, China needs access.
Right. Professor Fang, about that issue, you see, though, the Chinese Medicare covers some of those drugs, cancer drugs, but at the same time, it is still the families of those patients who have been going all the way, almost bankrupt, in order to save a patient if they really could. Professor Fang, how should we understand this?
I think that because the Chinese health insurance system is still like primary, so it's elementary. So we don't have very, very high coverage for those kind of very expensive procedures or drugs. So we just have a critical illness insurance. In Chinese we call 大病保险. So these actually will be used to cover some of the people if they have very, very high medical expenditures. In addition, we also have the medical rescue system. So in other words, almost like a Medicaid system in the U.S. And then for those kind of people, they need assistance. So we provide some financial assistance to them if they need like some money for healthcare insurance or healthcare costs, or even for their food and housing.
I see. But a lot of the things actually have been talking about before, right, Professor Fang? It's not been talking about just for this year, it's been talking about for years. So why we are still having so much problem not resolved? Of course, that would be the same question. I would like to throw it to Ms. Tulenko also very briefly. It seems that the healthcare issue has always on the priority, and yet many of the most important issues have not really been resolved over time. Very briefly for both of you, 30 seconds if you can, Professor Fang, what to pay attention to, what to work on as priority?
China is still a developing country, so we are trying to work hard to improve the well-being of the Chinese people, but we are still developing, so we need much more time.
So you think there still has to be a stretch of time before we can solve some of those problems?
I think so.
All right. Ms. Tulenko, briefly from you as well.
I'm very excited that the Chinese national insurer is starting to pilot programs where they pay by disease episode. For example, they would pay for breast cancer rather than doing billing for service, because that's a much more effective way to provide health care and a much more effective way to incentivize hospitals to be efficient.
A lot of changes are happening. Let's see whether they are really having a real impact to solve the real problem. Thank you so much for now. Kate Tulenko and Feng Hai, thank you. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up, so everyone have a great one. Bye for now.